This is our second webinar with the theme of reporting during COVID-19 that we are organizing for the Malaysian chapter. And today we are very, very excited to have both Donna and Red, who are from the Philippines, who will be our panelists for today's session. It will be a very interesting topic, which involve physical safety and risk mitigation strategies for community engagement. So we are targeting mostly journalists and also those working with Csos and NGOs who will be doing field reporting or field work during this period. And let me just brief the formalities. So we'll have 15 minutes each for the panelists, where they will be introducing the topic and we'll be giving you a brief. And then we can start moderating after that, and we will welcome the questions from the audience. So we want this to be a very interactive session. So we would like this to be more audience driven. So if you have any questions for both of the panelists, please include them into the chat box. So just to introduce who Internews is. So Internews is an international non-profit organization dedicated to giving people worldwide the news and information that they need, the ability to connect the means to make their voices heard. Since its formation in 1982, we have worked in more than 100 countries worldwide. And today Internews has active projects in more than 80 countries throughout Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, Eurasia, and the Middle East. Internews in Malaysia currently has media development projects including Ayuh Belia, Diverse Voice, and Suara Masyarakat or Community Voices. Suara Masyarakat is supported by the EU and aims to build the capacity of Malaysian journalists to deliver high-quality investigative and data journalism on reform processes in the country and develop community information, media and networks to improve governance by providing two-way communication between citizens and local authorities. To implement this, Internews in Malaysia team will be coordinating with our local partners, mainly Science of Life Studies or Csos, Sinar Project, and the Center for Independent Journalism. So I'll introduce to you both our speakers today. So first we have Victor Redmond S. Batario, or Red Batario, as he is more widely referred to in journalism and news safety circles in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. He is a former journalist with more than 30 years experience working for newspapers and television. He founded the Center for Community Journalism and Development in 2001 as a non-profit, non-stock organization that aims to support, encourage, and help sustain efforts of journalists working with citizens, communities, and institutions for social change. He has also been conducting since 2007 hostile environment safety training for journalists and human rights defenders in Southeast Asia. And he was the regional coordinator of the International News Safety Institute when it had regional offices around the globe. So thank you, Red, for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
Next we have Donna. So Donna Bartok has been a journalist for more than 30 years, 20 years of which were spent working for GG Press, a Japanese wire agency. She took up law while working and is now a lawyer, a data privacy officer, and a human rights advocate. During the pandemic, she went with photojournalists who continued to follow up the families of human rights victims of the Philippine government's anti-drug war and wrote an opinion piece about how women's stories were sidelined by the focus on health and economic hardship brought about the pandemic. So yes, so very excited to have the both of you, and I think we can start straight away. So I'll start first with Red, just with this question I want to throw to you. So based on your experience, as a journalist and safety instructor who has done coverage at hostile environments, so in parallel to COVID-19 right now, how can journalists and NGOs carry out risk awareness and assessments before they go to their assignments? And what are some of the key tips and measures to minimize risk and infection or infecting others during their work?
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. I think those are the main points that I will cover for this afternoon session. I think the more important aspect there is really preparing for deployment. So what risk assessment anyone will do, whether you're a journalist, you're an NGO worker, or community worker, it's very, very important to have this in place, not only as a tool, but also in your mind. It's something that you need to think through before being deployed or before going on assignment. And I think both hostile environments, situation or scenarios are similar to what we are having now in terms of the pandemic that is present in many parts of the all over the globe for that matter. So let me start by saying that, as I said, there are 3 points that I will cover for this afternoon. One is preparing for field deployment, and the second one is taking care of yourself and others, and then at the same time taking care of yourself after coverage, because it's very important to think through our own personal safety when we are doing our work, especially in this kind of situation. Many of the things that I will be discussing today are based on my own experience and those of other journalists in the Philippines, as well as advisories from media and health organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, the International News Safety Institute, Press Emblem Campaign, the WHO. Again, I will not talk about hand washing or physical distancing because there are gazillions of COVID-19 online and offline resources out there and numerous webinars and workshops organized about that subject. So I tried as much as possible to focus on practical safety considerations that can be useful for both journalists and NGOs. Again, it is important to be prepared for any situation or eventuality, and the best way to do that is to assess the risk before going on assignment, whether it is for a story or for community work. So I'd like to start by sharing with you a series of questions to help you assess the risk you might face out there. Although I'm sure many of you after a long lockdown period are impatient to go on assignment to areas outside of Kuala Lumpur. And if you have not done so already, I think you're all chomping at the bit. So I will incorporate, again, no, I just would like to point out that I will incorporate many of the points that we will discuss today into some sort of a safety guide, and I will send this to Nadia and Hanani a day or two after the forum so they can share it with you later. So now let's begin with the risk assessment with the questions that I put together. What do you need to ask yourself when you do a risk assessment before you go on assignment? Number one, what COVID-19 story or issue are you working on? Being able to identify the story that you will work on is essential to helping you map out your planning and preparation in terms of the risks you may face out there. Number two, how important and urgent it is. Is it? And why? Why is it important and why is it urgent? Because this will help you determine whether you are willing to take the risk of going to these areas. Number three, where will you be going? In Malaysia, for instance, and Nadia mentioned something about remote communities. So I'm sure these are areas that are very, very far from the capital. So is it a high-risk area in terms of the rate of infections or the number of cases? Are there sufficient healthcare services in the area? And then number four, who will you talk to? Who will you meet? Do they belong to sectors who are vulnerable to infections, such as the elderly, pregnant women, members of indigenous peoples communities? By the way, I read a story last year about several deaths and cases of hospitalization among members of the Batak tribe in Kelantan, and I'm sure a number of you have covered that story as well. And there might be similarities in terms of the risks involved, because it's also a disease outbreak at that time. And then number five, check with authorities if you are allowed to visit high-risk areas such as COVID-19 treatment wards in hospitals, because these are settings in which you need to wear full personal protective equipment so as to prevent you yourself from getting infected and from infecting others. So we will go to that in a little while. So how to avoid getting infected or infecting others. Before going on assignment, learn about health safety measures in the area you plan to visit. Do not proceed if you are unsure. Some high-risk areas include but are not limited to one, hospitals, healthcare facilities, quarantine, or isolation areas. Number 2, mortuaries, crematoriums, morgues. And number 3, homes for the elderly. Remember, older people are more vulnerable to infection. And I'm glad that we're having this remotely because I'm already 250 years old. Number 4, private residences where there could be a sick person or someone who is pregnant. And number 5, and this is important to consider always, indigenous people's community, especially one with little, if any, contact with outsiders, because people in these communities are usually more vulnerable to infectious diseases, especially those who have not developed natural immunity yet. So take this into consideration when you plan to go to remote communities there. And number 6, slum areas where houses are jam-packed and physical distancing is actually really impossible. Number 7, prisons or detention centers, which are overcrowded most of the time. Usually in the Philippines, a jail cell which is supposed to house about 50 persons usually has triple that number. Number 8, follow health safety protocols and guidelines set by the authorities. I will repeat this throughout because it's very important to follow all the safety protocols that have been set out by health authorities. Now, after you have prepared yourself to go on assignment, now let's talk about taking care of yourself while on assignment. Number 1, excuse me, take extra care when reporting or working in rural areas, as people may be fearful or resentful of outsiders who may bring the virus to their community. Learn how to deal with residents who may resent your presence. So try working through community leaders or village elders. They're your contacts. They're your first line of contacts in the community. If the residents remain adamant, back off. You can do the story or the community work some other day. Don't force the issue. Number 2, be alert to how the police or authorities implement lockdown measures. Have some sort of a situational awareness. Situational awareness is knowing what's going on around you. You're not so focused on just one thing, but you have a consciousness of what's going on your left, on your right, at the back of you. Especially in areas where there are security or lockdown checkpoints. Look out for police behavior. Are they relaxed or aggressive? In the Philippines, at least 2 persons have been shot dead by police for alleged lockdown violations. And yesterday, a prominent television journalist was apprehended by local authorities for removing his face mask for the simple reason that he wanted to take a sip of water. Number 3, as much as possible, conduct your interviews in an open space. If you have to do it indoors, choose a place with open windows. Use recorders or microphones or selfie sticks to extend distance between you and your subject whenever necessary. But before doing so, make it clear to the persons you are interviewing that it is also for their protection. Many Filipino reporters and camera persons have adopted this technique, especially for person on the street interviews. Number 4, try to avoid using cash and regularly disinfect your purse, wallet, credit cards. I think you're aware of this already, but this is just a reminder because sometimes we forget. We take out cash from our wallet, we pay, we get the change, we put it back, we take out our card, transact, and then put it back, and without sanitizing it, and then the whole thing gets infected. So just a reminder. And then number 5, carefully choose what you will wear, since some fabrics are easier to clean than others. This is an important consideration when you are on field assignment for an extended period of time. I usually bring 3 pairs of pants and shirts made of dry fit material that I can easily wash and dry. Remember, just like this, so it's easy. Remember, you need to disinfect yourself at the end of each day that you will be staying in that area. And one way of doing that is by washing your clothes regularly. Number 6, if you wear a niqab, make sure to put on a protective mask underneath. Remember, The niqab is simply a face covering. It does not protect the wearer from intrusions of germs or viruses. Okay? Face mask, since we're talking about masks. No? If you are using reusable ones and will be on assignment for more than a day, bring several sets, including filters, and have a Ziploc bag for storing the used mask, so they don't get mixed up with the clean ones. So these ones are for the used mask, and you have another container for the clean ones. For disposable masks, place in a temporary container or plastic bag before proper disposal. I have one here. Before I will dispose this in a trash bin that's for hazardous waste. Okay, number 8, avoid taking public transportation, especially during rush hour, and make sure to sanitize your hands with alcohol after disembarking. Number 9, if using company or personal vehicle, make sure those traveling with you have been medically cleared. Minimize the use of air conditioning and just keep the windows open and wear masks, of course. Why do you need to keep the windows open? Because according to health experts, it dissipates the virus easily, as opposed to a closed space where the virus lingers for quite some time. Number 10, and again, this is something that you should keep in mind all the time. Take regular breaks. Fatigue can make you careless and forgetful of safety protocols. So if you're so tired, sometimes you scratch your nose, you touch your eyes, and you remove your mask and forget to put it back on. Number 11, have a contingency plan. Okay, what do you do? Who do you call in case something goes wrong? Always have a backup. If you have a plan A, you should have a plan B. You should have a plan C and a plan D. All right. Now, for the third part, taking care of yourself and others after assignment. Before entering the house, your house, remove and disinfect shoes, sanitize hands with alcohol, placed near the entrance. Do not reuse clothes and instead, excuse me, place them in a separate laundry bin and take a shower before interacting with family members. Number 2, again, upon returning from a high-risk area, ask yourself, should you self-isolate? So before deployment, ask health authorities about self-quarantine protocols. Should you immediately just self-isolate after coming back from an assignment to a high-risk area? And then again, if yes, is there a space in your house where you can safely do that? Are there other options? Is there a hospital nearby or a quarantine space provided by NGOs? Consider other options as well for self-isolation. And then number 3, monitor your health condition and listen to updates and advisories from excuse me, relevant government agencies. List down the names, and number 4, list down the names, office or residential addresses, phone numbers or email addresses of all persons you interviewed or have closely interacted with for contact tracing purposes if it becomes necessary. So it becomes part of your protocol also when you go on assignment. Number 5, if you do develop symptoms, immediately inform local health officials and the management of your organization. It is also very important to take care of your psychological well-being. Organizations should practice duty of care excuse me, by making sure that staff are regularly checked and provided guidance and support. And as a journalist, as an NGO worker, CSO worker, you should also regularly discuss with family members your work, as they may be deeply concerned about your safety and the risk of infection that you may bring because of the work that you are doing, because they are also concerned about getting infected, especially if there are elderly people in your family, young children. I think it's very important to discuss the work and the risk that you are facing when you go on assignment. And number 3, consider the potential impact to your well-being your mental well-being of working in COVID-19 areas. For instance, you can consult online resources such as those of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. And I think it can work well also with NGO workers. So let me just share with you some lessons from the Philippines about covering from the pandemic. Early on, we realized the need for a quick response system. The Photojournalist Center of the Philippines set up its own stockpile of personal protective equipment such as masks, safety goggles, alcohol, sanitizing wipes for both members and non-members alike, especially those who are working as freelancers, because camera persons and photographers working for the big newspapers and television networks have their own PPEs. And then number two is coordination with health authorities is very important because it can result in better and safer access to community resources and sources while on coverage. For instance, in Metro Manila City and the Philippine Red Cross provided rapid and PCR-based tests to journalists covering the city. And then number three is psychological. Again, I will repeat, psychological well-being is equally important as physical health. It's okay to say no when you think you can take on the assignment. Okay, I'd like to end this short sharing with this meme forwarded to me by a journalist this morning. And I quote, "This is a public service, colon. If you have loss of sense of smell or loss of sense of taste, these are symptoms of COVID-19. Loss of common sense is not a symptom. It is the reason you got the disease." Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Red, for that. I think it's very apt to describe the situation now. And thank you so much for your sharing session. I think that was very comprehensive. You shared the pre, during, and also post strategies that all journalists and CEO members have to take into account when they're going to field work. Now I want to go to Donna. I think we want to touch more about, I guess, the community engagement factor. And I want to ask you, so how can journalists and CSOs devise alternative engagement plans during the COVID-19 period that takes into account the priorities and needs of the local communities? So Red mentioned about, consulting with existing community leaders and structures. So maybe you can elaborate more on that, especially when it comes to stakeholders in high-risk areas on the ground.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's the first. That's my first slide, because the most important thing that the journalist has to do is to get prior informed consent before interacting with the community. So, what's prior and informed consent? You'll have to talk to the community leaders first. You'll have to inform them what you want to do. You'll have to tell them about the risks that they face when they let you in. In some instances, you may be the one to tell them about COVID-19 and what they need to do. So next slide. Discuss your story and agenda with the community leaders, and then give them time to discuss it with the community members before asking for their consent, because you can't just talk to the community leaders and say, oh, this is how I want to do the story, and then let them make the decision for themselves. When we're talking about communities, especially about indigenous communities, there's a lot of interaction, I think. The members are usually consulted, at least here in the Philippines. They're asked and they actually help with the decision making. That's the first point. The second point is that you have to be aware that there may be different levels and structures of leadership. If you're going into an indigenous people's community, there will be the traditional community leadership, and then there will be the political one. For example, here in the Philippines, if you go down to the village level, the elected political leaders at the village level will be the same traditional ones. But as you go higher, this will be the traditional politicians who sometimes are at loggerheads with the interests of the community and often don't see eye to eye with the traditional community leaders. Red pointed out earlier the need to talk to the community leaders and to the police as well, and to observe them before going into a community. So that means much as you may want to go straight into the community, you shouldn't. Call them up first, get to know them, find out who the leaders are, and then start negotiation. Okay, point 3, don't forget to do research. How do you do research? First, you can do it online. Check out the news articles, request facts from government institutions, and then social media posts about the community that you're going to, and then about the area. During this pandemic, that's one changes that this pandemic has brought about. We have to do a lot of the research online to minimize the risks. So you can actually do that on Twitter, on Facebook, see what people are posting. You don't need to take each and every post as if it were true, but you can use the posts, the social media posts, to verify the truth. Like there was one instance where a journalist, did an article on Wuhan in China without having gone to Wuhan. Part of the verification that they did was checking out the background of the people who were posting, seeing if this were from as much as a year ago, checking if this is actually the hospital where the person said he was confined, and checking based on the color of the walls and on the background. You'll have to be more meticulous, but that's just the usual journalistic research that you really have to do anyway. So my point here is that while the standards of verification will not change, you still have to double check each and every fact, or before you your claims, before you pass them on as facts. But the way we do it may change. We may have to do more verification. We may have to use social media posts, but we will still have to verify those social media posts. Okay, and then last thing for journalists to remember is that getting consent and practicing safety protocols is your way of showing respect to your interviewees and to the community where you're going in. Remember, you're telling a story, but the story that you tell is about the lives that they lead. And the way you tell the story and the way you get that story may change their lives. So you need to be very conscious about it. For CSOs, it's the same thing. CSOs have to be sure that there was free, prior, informed consent from the community. So in this case, the CSO becomes the negotiator, the middleman between the journalist and the community. In some instances, the community will not be able to negotiate with the journalist. So it's up to the CSO to ensure that the community was informed about the risks that the risks that letting in of the risk of letting in a stranger. And you have to, as the CSO, you have to make it clear what you have to understand to get from the reporter the story that the reporter wants to tell, and then explain that to the community, and then explain to the community the possible impact of that publication in case there may be political or security impacts, and then the health risks. Because, for example, if the reporter wants to stay in the community for 4 days, where will the reporter stay? What's the risk of letting somebody sleep in a house in the village instead of somebody just going in to interview people for 2 hours? And then, so one thing to remember for the CSOs is that you can help the community negotiate with the media. But always remember too that the negotiation is not on how to tell the story, but on how to interact with the community. The problem, the dilemma of the journalist is that we are so used to verifying our facts through talking to people. talking to 10 people, if we can talk to 10 people just to check one fact, just to see if one sentence was correct. But now the interviews have to be more targeted because we can't talk to everyone that we want to talk to. We can just approach an old person, for example, or the more vulnerable ones. And when we talk to them, we have to be, there may be instances where we have to be the ones to tell them, please put on your mask, or for us to give them a mask. Usually, I think what will happen is a lot of you are based in the cities, a lot of you are based in Kuala Lumpur, and if you're going to areas that are not so interconnected, or where the information about COVID is not so well known, you'll be the one to tell them what the risks are. You'll be the one to explain to them that it comes from droplets. You'll be the one to tell them what the difference is between airborne and aerosol, and as all the things that Fred said. You might be the one you might have to be the one to tell them to do those things. Also, CSOs can help journalists by providing them with facts before the interviews, like, you want to interview this community of indigenous people, so is there anything I can help you with? Like, okay, I'm going to do a story about women. Well, there are so many women in the villages. Some of them are have this level of education. Some of them, a certain percentage are this level. Some of them are so many are married. So many have children. So that the journalist will not have to go around the area just to get the numbers. And then, as my last point for the journalists, there must be respect from both sides. While the community must respect the way a journalist does his or her job, the journalist has to respect community traditions and practice. This is important to remember. For example, here in the Philippines, there are some indigenous communities that already has this practice of isolating people when they get sick and contact tracing. So when you go into a community, you'll have to remember, you'll have to be aware that there may be practices or traditions that you may be violating. So that's why we go back to the first point. If you're as a journalist, you can't just barge into a community and say, I'm doing a story on this and I need someone to talk to. You'll need to do research first. You need to get to know them, and you'll need to talk to some of them before going into the area. That's it.
Yes, thank you so much for that session. And I think it is very pertinent what you reminded all of us in terms of respect. And I feel that two-way respect is something that we really need to be reminded of constantly in our line of work, whether you're a journalist or a CSO. I think a lot of people are just very excited right now to do their stories, to get the topics that they want, that sometimes they tend to forget this. But I hope journalists and CSO members would practice the guidelines that you did mention. But going back to maybe your field experience, I think I want to pose this question to both you and Red. With your experience doing on the ground coverage, and I think when I introduced you earlier, Dana, there was that part about you still covering like very pertinent topics that might have been kind of forgotten about during the pandemic, just because maybe lack of resources or not so much of focus on certain issues during this period. So in terms of that, maybe you can share what are some of the challenges that you face, I guess, during COVID-19 in terms of having the need to still accurately cover very important issues and amplifying that truth from the field. And what are some of the specific challenges that you might be encountering now that probably you did not before? And what are some of the ways that you have been able to kind of minimize kind of these hurdles in your work? So maybe this I can pose to both Dana and Red in terms of just your experience on the ground.
Okay, I'll answer first. During the pandemic, I don't drive. And so I had very limited mobility. I could only cover when I can go with the photojournalists who were covering. and so I was dependent on other people's schedule. Also, we did not have as much time to talk to them. That's why I couldn't write in-depth stories as well, because what we did was we were distributing donations, food packages to the families of human rights victims. But we were aware that as we go around, we might be carrying the virus with us, and we are talking to people who are very poor, they have very little to eat. So they will definitely not be able to afford the care that's needed when you get infected. So we limited our interaction, and of course, we would always wear a mask when talking to them, but we also limited our interaction. So that's one limitation. I couldn't go out. I couldn't talk to enough people. We would hear about cases of people being shot dead, but we couldn't go. Sometimes we couldn't go because the place is on lockdown. Sometimes because we didn't have a vehicle. That's why I had to learn to use social media, to use my contacts, to talk to people. Like, for example, okay, somebody got killed in that town. I know somebody who lives there. So would you happen to know this person? So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So that's one. Also, I had my other problem was, I think, mentally, perspective. I was caught up, like so many people were, about the focus on the pandemic. And so, as I said, the focus was about the health issues and the economic hardships. And yet there were stories about there should have been stories about how the pandemic worsens the existing inequalities. But how can you talk to the poor when you don't have the vehicle to go to them? And because there was no public transportation, so I couldn't even talk to them. I don't have a car. So that's one. And then there was the story about this jeepney driver, no, this fish vendor who was arrested and detained for violating quarantine. And it was only later, when I was thinking about it, that I realized that nobody was asking about his family. Our focus was the fact that he was detained, and so we were trying to get him out, to bail him out. But nobody asked about the wife who actually was the first to contact us, because she was looking for her husband. And so eventually somebody got to talk to the photographers and ask them, can you look for this person? And then one of the photographers started checking the jails. But nobody asked about the wife. How do you feel? How did you cope while your husband was away? Because she was partly blind. She had difficulties moving, but the husband became famous. So the family got a lot of help. It ended happily because the husband loves the wife. But I was thinking, nobody wrote about the woman in the story. And Gabriela, women's organization, has been very conscious in trying to promote women's issues here. And during the pandemic, there was a webinar about women's issues. So in a way, that helped. But yeah, so I think that's one. Those are my two issues. Logistics. It's hard to find people and to talk to them. And then second, also perspective, because I think COVID made us focus on itself, and we forgot that it only made the world a little more different, but it's the same. It's the same inequalities and problems with relationships.
Thank you, Donna. That was very insightful. And I think maybe, Red, you can add on to some of the challenges that you've observed, through your center, and what the journalists have been mentioning to you as some of maybe the extra challenges they face. But also, just to add on to maybe what Donna said, how can journalists also at the moment play catch up, I guess, to some of the coverage that they have missed out on during the pandemic, because there's like a big gap while we were in quarantine and in lockdown and trying to kind of chase for stories that were possibly postponed. So maybe you could add on to that as well.
Journalists here in the Philippines have gotten together, and I was one of those who convened several meetings among journalists, including reporters and photographers, about their concerns in covering the pandemic. And these are similar to what Dana had aired. The concern that she said, talked about, it's really about mobility. We should also keep in mind that in the early stages of the pandemic, the interagency task force overseeing the management of this pandemic has issued guidelines for coverage of journalists and um, how journalists should be certified by the presidential uh, um, communications office. So some sort of certification that these are the journalists who will be allowed to cover. So it really marginalized a number of other journalists to be able to do their jobs. But mostly those who have been affected by mobility issues were freelance journalists, those who do not belong to larger organizations, so they are not able to move around. And then again, the lack of interaction among the journalists about the issues that they are facing, some sort of a mechanism wherein they can discuss some of the challenges that they are facing and how they can go and address all of these challenges, especially those who are working in local communities, those who are working in the provinces outside of Metro Manila. These are people in Mindanao and in the Visayas. Usually we in Manila have a very hard time finding out what's going on there because of some issues and concerns also faced by journalists there. And add to that also is the reality that some of the news outfits, some of the news organizations, especially in the provinces, the smaller ones, have also been forced to close down or to slow down their operations because of economic reasons. They don't have the money anymore to pay the salaries, and so many other issues. But I think in terms of how safely the journalists will be able to cover the pandemic, it depends on the news organizations. The bigger ones were able to provide protective personal equipment to their employees, their reporters and photographers. But again, the freelance ones have to fend for themselves. That's why it's very important to have an organization like the Photojournalist Center of the Philippines, which was able to put together some sort of a storehouse of protective equipment that can be accessed by photographers who are their members and even non-members, especially the freelance ones.
Thank you, Red. So we have some questions from our participants here. So the first one, yeah, I think I can pose this to both of you. So Kelly would like to know, how do you protect the people you interviewed from being exposed or doxxed by the public or the government?
There are several ways. When I was still a reporter, what I do, especially when people are under threat in a certain area or in a certain locality, you don't have to identify them by name or place. I mean, you can use fictitious names so that you protect the identities of the people, for one, in a particular area that you are talking about or that you are writing about. So it's also very important to be able to, that's why it's very important to be able to talk with the people in the community and even those in the surrounding communities, especially the elders, especially the respected leaders in those areas, about how to proceed when doing your stories, because they will have a better understanding of local conditions and how to better protect themselves from intrusions, like let's say from being exposed. They can propose other ideas to a reporter if a reporter is out there to do the story.
Yeah, like on my part, there was a story I wanted to do about the situation in the jails. So I talked to somebody who was just released from detention, but I had to explain to the person that I wanted to use her name because the person was just recently, so he or she could talk about the situation, but the person was afraid that there might be security considerations. I was asked to talk to the lawyer who handled the case, and the lawyer said, maybe not. You'll have to use an alias. So I had to ask the editor. So in the end, I still have not written the story. The point is that you cannot protect your sources if you really use their name and their picture. That's why you have to explain to them that there are these risks. If this happens to you, like for example, doxing, it's illegal here in the Philippines, so you can complain, but of course, we don't know what will happen to the complaint. So that's why you can't just talk to people. Here in the Philippines, we have a data privacy law that's a little strict. You can't just take pictures of people. They can actually complain about it. And well, one exemption is the news media, but so that's it. So basically, you just need to explain to them the risks. And if they say they don't want to take the risks, then you'll have to find another source.
Thank you. I think there's another follow-up question on the issue of doxing here. It's from Hyra. So on the current environment of doxing, or even off via public professional profiles and threats to journalists in Malaysia, what are the basic precautions in your day-to-day routine to stay safe?
In my case, my Facebook profile is quite restricted. A lot of the content I post are not made public. Also, I don't include in my Facebook profile the names of my family. I don't actually mention even during casual conversation my family. I don't post current pictures. So that's one of my precautions. I use Proton Mail. I also have Gmail, but I use Proton Mail more. I'm transitioning to that. For communications, I usually use secure messaging apps. But also you can, sometimes doxing will happen. So you just try to do what you can.
I don't do social media. I don't have Facebook, but I do. I have Proton Mail. I have Signal, and the only social media that I would have is Viber and also WhatsApp, and that's it.
Okay. So we'll go to the next question. From Hanani. So should the organizations, editors, or CSO management be responsible to carry out risk assessment for all their staff? Because media houses are struggling to survive, so this might not be on top of their priorities at the moment.
But I think they should be, because it's the duty of care rests with the news organization, whether you have the resources or not. And if you have the capability to field your reporters and your staff outside, it is your duty and responsibility, the duty and responsibility of the news organization to provide duty of care. And it doesn't really take much. You don't even have to provide, if you don't have enough money to provide for personal protective equipment, you can access from NGOs. But what I'm saying is that safety protocols can be provided by, and risk assessment, for instance, can be provided by news organizations to help their staff when they are sent out on assignment. It is the duty. It is the duty and responsibility of news organizations. And I think economic conditions in this instance should not be an excuse to not being able to do that.
Just to go back on the previous question, so there was a clarification from Hira who asked the question. So the question was more on how do you keep yourself safe, once they know who you are, basically, like where you work and other private information, I guess, in terms of what happens after you've been doxxed.
I don't think you can really keep yourself safe if somebody wants to go after you. Yeah. Like, it's basic protocol for me that I try not to take the same road twice. Yeah. But somebody really wants to target you, It's a risk you have
Yeah.
to take. It happens.
Yeah. One thing you can do is take precautionary measures, like Dana said. I mean, don't follow a set routine going home or coming home, going to work, change routines every now and then. Don't go back home or every day at the same time. And then take other precautionary measures. That's why it's very, very important also to have this kind of situational awareness. So knowing what's happening, so you have a sense of whether I'm being followed or not physically, but electronically you can be put under surveillance and you wouldn't know about it. But these are things, these are the risks that journalists and activists face on a day-to-day basis, especially now in this time of the pandemic when the repression is also increasing, like here in the Philippines. But there are certain precautions, of course, that you can take, like being very aware of the realities around you, being aware of these threats and being aware of these risks.
Like if you pass through mirrors, glass windows, I
Mm.
automatically look at the back. I don't look at what's in front of me, but at the
Yeah.
reflection. It's something that you acquire through the
Yeah.
years, but it's something that you should acquire.
Right.
I think for the next question is something that I would like to ask both of you, I guess. There was a mention earlier about, giving, the power to negotiate to community members, in terms of when we want to go out and do field reporting and things like that. So, but as we know, a lot of community, I guess, media or community journalism or citizen journalism right now is struggling as well, due to lack of resources and funding. So what would be some of the recommendations or suggestions that you would have in terms of being able to still empower this citizen journalism and community journalism at this time of the pandemic? Because I guess, in Malaysia, the media organizations, like, as you know, are mainly focused in KL, where resources are a lot more available. So how about like the lesser finance or lesser sustainable kind of media organizations that are at the community level? How would they be able to empower themselves during this time to still amplify the stories that they want to tell?
I think a number of media organizations in the local communities in the Philippines have relied also on the citizen journalists, on the posts of citizen journalists, those who are out on the streets and are being able to capture events as they happen, and use this to explore further what's behind that story. And I think the citizen journalism in this instance is able to help mainstream journalism to be able, and mainstream journalists to be able to tell the story through their own eyes. So it's a reverse of things. It's now people on the streets who are feeding the media information, so that the mainstream media will be able to amplify these voices and these events that are happening on the ground. In terms of sustainability, it's really a challenge, especially for the smaller news organizations in the provinces, and even in some of the the ones in Metro Manila. But I guess that's a truism that's applicable to many other businesses in the country right now, or in the world for that matter. So it also behooves journalists to be more creative in terms of being able to get out the story. In one place in Cotabato, for instance, that's in Mindanao, it's a province in Mindanao, where there's a small community radio. What they're doing is working with volunteers to be able to get the story out. And these are farmers, these are fisher folk, these are drivers of public utility vehicles, and they provide the information that then the journalists are able to send out and package as news stories.
Yeah, that was a dilemma before. during better economic times when the mainstream media organizations would use the community journalists. And sometimes because, you know, these people are so eager to tell the stories of their communities, like for example, in conflict areas, they take the risks. But the problem was, you know, if they die, in a way, they get paid very little and then they take a lot of risks. And then if they die, the company is not responsible for them because they're just stringers and correspondents. But unfortunately, I think during this time, it's a lot of it is gonna be unpaid media work, especially if you're just talking to if you're just getting stories from the ordinary people. But that's the way it's gonna work at this time because media organizations are closing down. Community media or news outlets can hardly survive. A lot of them, as Red mentioned, several have already closed down. Some are reduced to digital versions, and so before we used to say that, you know, people have to pay for news, but now exactly just when news is most important, people seem to be less willing to pay for it. And the one that shoulders the pain, part of the pain, is the journalist, because there's just less money to pay the journalist with, especially when it comes to the community journalists. So how to empower them? I think the best thing is what Red said. Push for community journalism, keep training the people, because at least that way, you know, the jeepney drivers, the farmers, they got trained to write. They were able to acquire a new skill. That's sort of the payment that you can give in exchange for the stories that you have taken from them. That's it.
Yeah. So I wanted to know as well, in terms of protecting your sources and, you know, the people who are providing you the stories, and understandably a lot of them could be from vulnerable groups or communities. Have you observed anything that has become like an additional barrier to doing that during the pandemic? You know, I mean, it's already hard enough as I guess during normal times, but are there any kind of extra challenges now because of the pandemic?
Extra challenges is basically they could be more exposed. So what I do is I ask myself if I really need to write the story, and if I can do it some other way. If I know them enough to interview them by phone, if I can do research beforehand, as I said, so that I don't need to talk to them for a very long time. Basically, that's it. Another way of protecting your sources, of course, is not just because of the pandemic, but because they might be persecuted because they're your sources. If, for example, in cases of political stories or human rights stories. So that's why you also need to be aware whether you're being tailed. If somebody's following you, then you don't talk to your source, because while you may not be harassed, your source might be.
We have one question here from an additional question from the audience. So Hafsa is asking, there are lack of journalists or reporters and or editors that specialize in public health reporting, which can add to the mistrust of the public on the information shared. So, so in terms of the pandemic, they focus on the pandemic, but they're not doing in-depth coverage. So the question is, how do we counter this kind of mistrust?
By doing our job, which is doing in-depth reporting.
Yes, maybe in addition to that, it's really more a kind of explanatory journalism, because right now what we're having is just a reporting of what's happening around us, like the number of people who are dying every day, the number of cases that are always rising, but there is really no story that, or not much of stories about I think Donna said this earlier, no? About how do this impact local communities and local people. What do they think about this? Is this something that they can live with? What do they think about the future? What do they think about their children? What do they think about their community or their neighborhood? It's some sort of a story that projects or presents the human side of this pandemic.
If you really look at what media is supposed to do, remember the duty of media is to give people information that they need so that they can live better lives. So how did media cover this pandemic? By focusing just on the number of cases and just on the deaths, by focusing on the narrative that the government wanted media, everyone to focus on. In a way, it didn't do its job well enough. It should have focused, for example, on the impact on the marginalized people, on the farmers. What's the impact of the pandemic on the farmers, on the fishermen? We don't know. Okay, so government says inflation is 2.5% this month, but what does that mean? And nobody's even reporting on the hospital capacity. The cases are rising, but how many beds are we adding to the hospital? Although we're adding lab testing centers, nobody's checking how many beds we're adding. The OH is reporting on that. And I think since February, they've added just a few more thousand beds, hospital beds. So that's the problem. People are told, okay, this is a pandemic. It's frightening. It's killing people. But what to do? How to adjust aside from washing your hands? And then how should employers behave? What's the duty of employers to the employees that they have asked to report for work? Media needs to see it as an issue that affects people, societies, as an issue that impacts on the inequalities that were existing beforehand. And did the inequalities disappear? Did the pandemic, did the virus strike everyone the same way? Or did the rich get a better treatment than the poor? In the Philippines, I haven't seen any stories, not many stories like that. I don't know about in Malaysia. So if your point is there is a mistrust because media has not been doing its job well enough, well, yes, it hasn't been doing its job well enough. And the only way that it can earn the trust of the people is when it actually serves the people. Because that's what media is supposed to do. We're supposed to tell the people, to help the people live better lives.
Thank you, Donna. I think, yeah, I think I really echo it, that opinion. I really agree with that. And I think the fact that we need, as journalists and NGOs, we need to listen to our communities like a lot more as well, especially now during the pandemic. I think that's a point that we can't emphasize enough. Before, I think we can wrap up the session soon, but just one last question for both of you. So in the Philippines, how are the journalists basically showing their solidarity for each other? Like you said, there's a lot of gap right now, or in terms of the work, maybe due to extra challenges, but also maybe to an increase in self-censorship and other issues in the media environment. So what kind of efforts are being done right now in terms of showing solidarity for both just physical and mental health in the Philippines, just to ensure that journalists can still do their job and cover the stories that matter to everyone?
Maybe by way of illustrating, the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, for example, has peer-to-peer counseling. It's a peer counseling program that journalists under stress can access. So you will have another journalist who have been trained in trauma counseling will be able to talk with you, even online, and discuss the issues that you are facing. But having said that, there's also a sense of unity among the journalists and the media organizations. For instance, just this morning, there was a huge caravan of journalists together with the civil society groups to protest the non-issuance or non-renewal of the franchise license of a big network in the Philippines. So this has been going on for quite some time. These protest actions What I would like to emphasize here is that the media in the Philippines is also not working alone, because they are working in partnership with civil society organizations, especially rights organizations, especially when these issues impact on FOE and also the safety of journalists.
Do you
Yeah,
have any?
basically, yeah, just the same thing.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to both Dana and Red for your time today. And thank you to our participants for your questions. And I think those who missed out the earlier part of this session, Red did mention that he will send Hanani and I the guidelines that he kind of briefed on earlier in the session. So we do have your email address, and we will contact you, to distribute that guideline. So we hope that will benefit you and your work. And also, just to inform everyone that this video will be published possibly in a week's time, and we will include Bahasa Malaysia subtitles so that you can share it more widely as well. And I guess that's all from us today. We would like to thank you for joining us on this session, for your questions. And if you have anything else that you want to ask, maybe after this webinar, you can always contact myself or Hanani at our email address. So yes, I think that's all from us. And thank you so much, Red and Dana, again, for your time.
Thank you too.
Yeah, thank you so much for your
Okay,
insight.
bye-bye.
Okay,
Really
bye.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.